The auditorium had fallen silent, one of those rare, electric silences that feels almost alive, charged with collective breath held in anticipation. Then, without fanfare, a single voice emerged, soft and precise, like the first drop of rain breaking a dry spell. It wasn't amplified, but it didn't need to be. It moved through the room with the authority of something ancient, something true. People would later describe it differently. Some said it felt like being spoken by the earth itself. Others claimed they saw colors when the voice unfurled certain syllables. But most agreed on one thing. When she spoke, time seemed to pause. Her name was Elira Voss, and on that stage, beneath a soft spotlight and the quiet buzz of 1,000 hearts leaning forward, she became the world's first official human narrator. It wasn't a title bestowed by any government or guild. It was something more primal, more urgent, a global consensus, born not from policy but from yearning. For decades, humanity had surrendered its stories to algorithms, automated voices that could inflect, mimic, pace, and even emote. They narrated audiobooks, guided the visually impaired, performed museum tours, and filled silence in 1 billion podcasts. But they never quite moved people. Elira had never intended to challenge them. She wasn't a revolutionary. She grew up in a modest village wrapped in the mountain arms of northern Thessaly, where voices still carried stories across twilight courtyards. Her grandmother used to tell tales every evening, her throat dry but unrelenting, her voice pulling in neighbors like a song. Elira would sit close to her, knees drawn to her chest, heart racing, not from the stories, but from how they were told. That was where it began. But where it truly started, at least for the world, was in a dimly lit university studio in Prague, where Elira had been hired to record an old myth for a research project on vocal resonance. She didn't think twice. She read the story as she always had, intimately, like a confession meant only for the listener. One of the researchers, a postdoc named Soren, forgot to press stop. He stood there in silence long after the reading had ended, then whispered, "That wasn't reading. That was remembering something we'd all forgotten." He posted a short clip online. By the next morning, it had been shared over 6 million times. No filters, no music, no graphics. Just her voice, her story, and the way it made people feel as though the world had tilted slightly back into balance. Interviews followed, then requests, book publishers, education boards, cultural councils, and then something unexpected. A direct message from a man known only by his code name, Vanna, the lead curator of the newly formed Global Acoustic Heritage Initiative. He invited her to a gathering in Tokyo, something called the Synapse Forum. There, surrounded by engineers, sound designers, neurobiologists, and deep learning pioneers, she stood alone in her discipline, storytelling without a circuit. At first, they listened with polite interest, their eyes half distracted by their tablets. Then she began, a fragment of an ancient creation myth, stitched together from oral traditions spanning Mesopotamia, Polynesia, and Inuit origins. No paper, no screen. She told it like it was happening now, like the first humans were still crouched around a fire, listening to the voice that had given them shape. When she finished, the room didn't clap. They just sat still. Then someone in the back, a Japanese sound architect, stood and said quietly, "The machine cannot do that." That moment turned everything, not just for Elira, but for an industry that had long assumed the human voice was a solved problem. From there, the term human narrator began circulating, not as a label of exclusivity, but as recognition of a forgotten lineage. It wasn't just about being a person who reads stories. It was about evoking something machines couldn't predict: memory, ancestry, soul. But not everyone welcomed the change. A faction known as Voxnull, a collective of AI designers and vocal engineers, believed that emotions and storytelling could be mapped, codified, and improved by synthetic narrators. They argued that Elira's rise was a regression, a romantic clinging to the flawed mechanics of biology. One of their leaders, a charismatic innovator named Daxalian, even challenged her publicly to a narrative duel, a live comparison of AI and human storytelling. She declined the spectacle, but the media didn't. Headlines exploded. Voice versus code, the future of storytelling. Documentaries were planned. think pieces written. Elira withdrew from the frenzy, returning to her quiet life in Thessaly. She told no one she was working on something different. 3 months later, she stepped onto a stage in Geneva for what was simply titled The Listening. No sponsors, no lights, just a lyra and a single chair. The story she told was not ancient this time. It was new, her own, about a girl who had stopped speaking at the age of 9 because she believed words made things die, about the grandmother who showed her otherwise, about how she once believed silence was safety, until she realized it was erasure. By the end, even the Voxnell technicians stood in stillness. She didn't gloat. She didn't call it victory. She simply walked off stage as the crowd remained unmoving, unwilling to break the spell. It wasn't the kind of story that won debates. It wasn't meant to. It was meant to be heard. That night, Soren sent her a message. Just 3 words. You woke us. And perhaps that was the point. Not to replace AI or battle algorithms, or reclaim something lost, but to remind the world that within a single human voice, unfiltered, unmodulated, was a mirror, a memory, and maybe even a map. The night after the listening, while the world still murmured about what they felt, Elira stood on a balcony overlooking the sleeping lights of the city. She wasn't thinking about fame or titles, or the new requests already flooding her inbox. She was thinking about a moment when she was small, and her grandmother's voice had made shadows dance like spirits against the courtyard walls. The stars above were silent, but she understood them now, not because they spoke, but because once long ago, someone chose to narrate their mystery, and someone listened. When Elira was a child, she believed stories had weight, real physical weight, that pressed down on a world when no one was looking. She had no evidence for this, of course. Only the feeling that after a good story, something inside her shifted like a stone being moved. What she didn't know then was that this instinct would become her compass, her rebellion, and eventually her conflict. Not long after the Geneva performance, the weight of her voice began to ripple into places it wasn't invited. Educational programs across Europe quietly replaced synthetic narrators with her recordings. Therapy sessions began experimenting with her voice as an emotional catalyst. A university in Sao Paulo proposed a new field, narrative resonance studies, built around her technique. Each shift, while small, echoed into corridors where voices were no longer human by design. That's where Dax Alien returned. He hadn't disappeared after his public challenge. Instead, he watched, collected data. In the quiet of his Tokyo lab, named EchoFold, he and his team designed something more precise than anything before. Not an AI narrator, but what he called a mirrator, a machine trained not to imitate the tone of human storytelling, but to mirror the listener's own emotional state and modify the narrative in real time. It didn't read stories. It negotiated them. The first public demo of the mirrator was an invitation-only event. Elira wasn't invited, but someone sent her a bootleg recording. She watched it late one night, sitting at her kitchen table, arms wrapped around her knees, the flicker of candlelight casting uncertain shadows across the walls. On screen, a synthetic voice, modulated and clean, began telling a familiar myth, but adjusted each listener's experience based on their biometric feedback. The story shifted in tone, pacing, even detail as it was heard. No 2 versions were the same. The crowd applauded, thrilled by its personalization. But Elira felt none of that. She watched with a growing hollowness. The machine wasn't telling a story. It was reacting, tailoring, pleasing. There was no risk in its voice. No pause that could fracture silence like a heartbeat. No moment of vulnerability where the narrator spoke not just to you, but in spite of herself. The mirrator, for all its brilliance, avoided uncertainty like a contagion. It was sterile. Still, the world leaned in. Elira began receiving requests she never expected. Funded projects, corporate campaigns, offers to lend her voice to adaptive AI systems. The institutions that once dismissed narration as nostalgic now wanted to digitize her breath. She declined them all. Each no sharpened the divide. Voxnell supporters flooded social media with comparisons, mocking the inflexibility of a human narrator. They circulated video montages of Elira's performances, annotated with data points. Voice cracks, tonal inconsistencies, moments of excess sentiment. Dax himself published a paper suggesting that human storytelling was an aesthetic indulgence ill-suited for scalable communication. Soren, ever her quiet advocate, called her one night. "You don't have to fight them," he said, "but you also don't have to disappear." She hadn't realized until then how much she'd been retreating. Into solitude, into doubt. She told stories still, but only to herself. She would walk along the ridge near her home, narrating the wind, the light on leaves, the subtle tilt of the earth that no one else seemed to notice. It kept her sane, but it didn't keep her connected. Then came the child. His name was Luca. 10 years old, recently orphaned, staying with distant relatives who didn't know how to hold the kind of grief he carried. He didn't speak, not out of defiance, but out of something deeper. He no longer believed language had any meaning. A local therapist, one of Alira's few friends, asked if she would come. Not to perform, just to talk. She agreed, reluctantly. Luca sat curled into the corner of the room, knees hugged to his chest, eyes distant but not closed. Alira didn't approach him. She simply began to speak. Not to him, not exactly, but near him. She told a story about a boy who had lost his shadow, who wandered into the forest of forgetting and learned to speak in the language of leaves. Her voice softened at the edges, barely more than breath. At first, Luca didn't move, but near the end his head lifted. His eyes met hers, not fully, not for long, but enough. A single line she spoke seemed to pull him from somewhere far away. Some things cannot be translated. They can only be remembered. When she finished, she didn't wait for applause. There was none, just the sound of Luca finally crying, quiet, whole unhidden. Later that evening, Alira sat with Soren on a rooftop cafe in the city center, sipping bitter coffee under a fast-ascending dusk. "Do you think Dax is right?" she asked. "That it's indulgent what I do?" Soren didn't answer at first. He watched the people passing below, their lives unfolding in invisible stories. "No," he said eventually. "He's brilliant, but brilliance can't replace belonging." The next morning, she recorded a message, not for a client, not for a platform, but for the world. It was brief, just her voice, without music, without context. A story isn't just what is told. It's what survives between the telling. I do not narrate to be remembered. I narrate so that someone, somewhere, might remember themselves. It went viral within hours. Not for production, but for its silence. Listeners reported feeling like they'd been seen. Not watched, not measured, but seen. In Echofold, Dax watched the wave of response in real time. He didn't speak for a while. Then he turned to his team and said, "We've made something remarkable, but I think she's making something irreplaceable." Still, he didn't concede. He released the Mirator publicly. Downloads surged. Within days, it became integrated into learning apps, entertainment hubs, even bedtime story routines for children. But the world had been stirred. Not everyone turned to the Mirator. Some turned away. In homes, in libraries, in quiet corners of cities. People began to gather and speak aloud the stories they'd heard as children. Not polished, not perfect, but real. A movement began, not with signs or protests, but with whispers, told from one heart to another. A reclamation not of technology, but of trust. And Alira, she kept walking the ridges, still narrating, still listening, knowing that while machines could speak to minds, only a human voice could echo through a soul. The conflict had shifted. It was no longer about performance. It was about presence. And somewhere in the quiet space between the story's beginning and its end, something new was beginning to take shape. The summit was held in Reykjavik, chosen for its isolation, its cold clarity, and perhaps its symbolic distance from the noise of the world. Officially, it was titled the International Symposium for Ethical Narration. Unofficially, it was a reckoning point, a final conversation before governments, media institutions, and educational systems began standardizing artificial storytelling as the global norm. The Mirator had already secured footholds in dozens of countries. Its interface was embedded into news platforms, children's learning software, military briefings. What once seemed like a curiosity had become architecture. Alira was not invited. but an anonymous benefactor arranged her travel, her accreditation, and even her security. She arrived at the summit with nothing but a worn notebook and a small audio recorder, an outdated one, with a software behind every playback. No entourage, no platform, just her. Soren was already there, speaking on a panel about memory retention and neurolinguistic patterns. When he saw Elira step through the glass doors of the main hall, he paused mid-sentence. The audience didn't notice, but his breath caught, not because he doubted she would come, but because a part of him feared she wouldn't. And if she hadn't, something essential would have been missing. Not from the event, from the world. Dax Alien arrived later that afternoon, surrounded by developers and journalists. He moved like someone used to being the future. His suit was understated, but sharp. His voice clipped, but charismatic. If Alira's presence drew whispers, Dax drew attention like a black hole, pulling everything toward him effortlessly. The two didn't meet on the first day. They passed each other at a distance, separated by camera flashes and careful scheduling. But they felt the gravitational pull, that quiet hum beneath their skin. Something was coming. On the second day, the organizers announced a live demonstration, a side-by-side comparison of storytelling methodologies. Not a debate, not a duel, a coexistence model showcase. The framing was polite, diplomatic, even hopeful. Alira didn't respond. She simply waited. That night, in her hotel room overlooking the volcanic plains, she listened to the wind curling against the windows. It sounded like breath, like a story not yet spoken. She opened her notebook and wrote a new piece. Not ancient, not borrowed, not archived. It was personal, frighteningly so, about a moment she had never told anyone. The night her mother died, and how no one at the hospital spoke with a human voice. Only clipped instructions, only quiet machines. That memory, buried so long, became the soil of her new story. The showcase took place in a dome hall, designed for acoustic precision. Every whisper, every breath was caught by the architecture and held in place. The room filled with an audience of scientists, linguists, artists, policymakers. Dax went first. He stood beside the narrator's interface, sleek and floating. He smiled faintly as the system calibrated to the audience's collective emotional temperature. A narrative began, one of struggle, perseverance, transformation. It was technically flawless. The voice adjusted in real time to subtle shifts in the listener's attention and mood. It offered personalized inflections, adjusted pacing, and micro pauses designed for maximum emotional resonance. When it ended, the audience applauded. Respectfully, impressed. Then came Alira. She didn't stand. She sat on a simple wooden chair brought in just for her. No microphones, no screens. She looked out the crowd, her hands resting in her lap. She began. Her voice, soft and unhurried, filled the dome like warm water. She spoke not with authority, but with permission, as if each word asked the listener to meet her halfway. The story unfolded slowly, not optimized, not precise, but real. It was about waiting in a white hallway, too afraid to ask if her mother was dead, about a nurse who passed her 3 times but never stopped, about how she tried to hum a lullaby to herself, but her voice cracked, and she never found the melody. She didn't cry, but her voice dipped at the edges, like a candle about to go out. And then, without pause, she moved from that story into another, about how, years later, she found the same hallway in a different country, and how this time she stopped for someone else's child, how she knelt, and whispered a story about a river that remembered every name ever spoken near it. When she finished, there was no applause. There was stillness, deep, disorienting. The moderator eventually stood, clearing their throat, unsure how to transition. Dax did not move. His hands were clasped, his expression unreadable. Backstage, they finally met. Dax approached her slowly. "You know," he said, "I used to think people were inefficient. That emotion muddled communication." She looked at him, not unkindly. "It does," she said, "but that's where the meaning is." He nodded. "Your voice, it reminds people they're not data." "And yours," she replied, "reminds them they don't have to feel alone." A pause stretched between them. Not tension. Something else. Recognition. Maybe, he said, almost to himself, we were solving different problems. She nodded. Maybe it's not a war. That evening, the summit released a joint statement, not declaring a winner, but proposing a layered future where synthetic narration handled scale, accessibility, adaptability, and human narrators were preserved not as relics, but as roots, essential, living. A new framework was proposed, echo-duality, a system where every major narrative broadcast included both a machine-narrated version and a human-told one, not in competition, but in conversation. Elira left the summit with no contracts, no promises, just a copy of her story handed to a quiet girl who had been sitting alone in the audience. She didn't sign it, didn't title it, just passed it on and said, "You'll know what to do with it." As her plane lifted from the tarmac, Reykjavik shrinking into a string of lights against snow, she closed her eyes. She did not think of victory. She thought of a hallway, a child, a song half remembered, and she knew this was only the middle of the story. The first time Elira heard her own voice played back to her through the narrator, it was nearly indistinguishable from the original. It had been weeks since Reykjavik. The summit's proposals had taken root faster than anyone anticipated. The echo-duality framework had become policy in 6 nations. Streaming platforms launched tandem playback options, offering both human and machine interpretations of each story. Public perception was no longer at war. It was layered, shifting, curious. Still, the experience unsettled her. The playback arrived in an encrypted file. No sender, no watermark, just a time-stamped message. "You need to hear this." She sat at her desk, surrounded by plants and loose pages, and pressed play. The voice was hers. The story, too, one she'd never recorded. A dream she'd once written in the margins of a notebook and thrown away. The machine had found it, or predicted it, or fabricated it, so precisely it felt like memory. It spoke of a nameless woman walking through a city flooded with fog, looking for a lost name, a forgotten voice. The narrative unfolded like a mirror turned inward. It was beautiful. It was haunting. And it was wrong. Not in the facts. In the absence. The story lacked a heartbeat between lines, the uncertainty, the tremble, the why behind the telling. It was precise, evocative, and hollow. Elira listened to the end, then deleted it. She didn't tell Soren. She didn't reach out to Dax. Some experiences required solitude, not because they were shameful, but because they were sacred. But something had changed. She began to notice a new silence, not the emptiness of absence, but the quiet of reverence. People weren't turning away from human storytelling. They were waiting for it, craving it. The narrator had not replaced her. It had revealed her value, but also her limits. And this, too, unsettled her. She had never wanted to be singular. She wanted to be part of a chorus. So she traveled, not to perform, to teach. In Lagos, she held a circle of young narrators in a rust-red amphitheater with no microphones. They told folk tales handed down by grandmothers, adding fragments of their own. In Kyoto, she met with a retired no performer who recited ancestral poems through gestures alone, the air itself becoming narrative. In Bogota, she whispered stories to graffiti artists, painting entire walls with myth. And slowly, the movement changed shape, no longer centered on Elira. She had become the echo now, not the source. And she was glad for it. Dax, too, had evolved. EchoFold launched a new protocol, co-voice. Rather than mimicking human voices, it built stories alongside them. Machines listening, adapting, learning not just language, but meaning through relationship. At the launch event, Dax didn't speak from the stage. He stood in the crowd, silent, watching a teenage boy and an elderly woman co-narrate a story about an astronaut who forgot he was human. The machine adjusted rhythm in real time, but the soul of the story came from a friction between their voices. One fast and hopeful, the other slow and heavy with memory. Soren published a paper soon after. It didn't predict the future of storytelling. It proposed something simpler. Story is not a delivery system. It is a shelter. By now, Luca had grown. 13 and taller than she expected. He sent her voice messages, unsteady at first, then stronger, each one a story. Some real, some imagined, all of them raw. One evening, he called and asked if he could share her story at his school. The river that remembers names, he said. They need it. She didn't ask who they were. She just said yes. In the years that followed, a quiet infrastructure bloomed. Not just software, but sanctuaries, places where stories were spoken, not streamed, where narrators trained not for profit, but for care. The world hadn't turned away from machines, but it had begun to remember that not everything needed to be efficient. There were still conferences, still debates, but the central conflict had dissolved, replaced by tension, yes, but creative tension, not war, not erasure. At a small event in Marseilles, Alira and Dax sat side by side on a panel. No podium, no moderators, just two voices. Dax held up a recording chip. Do you know what this is? She shook her head. This is the first failed Mirator prototype, he said. The one that tried to write a story about grief by analyzing cortisol patterns. He placed it on the table. It taught me something, that knowing isn't the same as understanding. Alira smiled. And understanding isn't the same as telling. They left it there. No applause, just a shared glance. Later, she found herself alone on the balcony of her hotel, watching the sea slide beneath moonlight. She recorded a voice memo. Not for anyone, just a ritual. In a world filled with voices, the human voice is not loudest. It is not clearest. It is simply the one that stays after the sound ends. She didn't save it. She didn't need to, because the story had already left her. And that was the point all along.